Okay, so let's start right off. So today we're going to start with a little video, part of the documentary program me and Canon Hersey produced, 3 minutes video about what we have done in terms of John Hersey's life and the universality of his message. So let's play the video. 아, 音が切れてないかな？来てるかな？ Okay, we're gonna do it again. Yeah, it's a video, short video of Canon Hersey made this journey into Hiroshima in 2015, made a documentary film for NHK. And this is a good summary. This is a good summary of his journey.
あ、音が聞こえないですね。たくさん音が聞こえません。
音声が聞こえないですね。
聞こえないですね。たくさん、are you there? あ、入ったかな。では、もう一度初めから。
I feel like I should give a play-by-play here, but I'm sorry about the audio problems that we're having. This is really the opening of our second 50-minute film that Taku and I made together in 2015, and really retracing the steps of John Hersey to Hiroshima. We also spent a good deal of time in Nagasaki, listening to survivors and trying to really hear this history and bring this history into the 21st century, allow young people or audiences to relate to Hiroshima in a new and fresh way, but in the same way as John Hersey, to bring people close to people like Koko Kondo and allow them to have deep and meaningful thoughts about the Hiroshima survivors and where we are as a world. And I would say today, 6 years later, I feel like Taku and I have, and 28 trips to Hiroshima later, I feel like we've really, learned so much. So it's great to be here together with all of you on this really important day of the anniversary of John Hersey's publishing of Hiroshima, and looking forward to a very exciting dialogue about the future of journalism together. So it's nice to be here with all of you. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Hang with us.
No problem. And I'd like to introduce today's panelists. First with Solly Granatstein. How are you?
Hello.
Excellent. And also Keiko Tsuyama from Japan. How are you?
From New York City, actually.
From New York City, of course.
From Queens.
Excellent. So three of Canon, Solly, and Keiko will have a panel discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Professor Peter Kuznick of American University. He is an expert in the history of nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferations, and also especially very familiar with the impact of Hiroshima in 1946 and on. And I'd like to ask you, Peter, about the impact of Hiroshima today. So take it away. You can unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. You can volume it up a little bit.
Wonderful to see you, Peter, again. Long time.
Good to see you.
It's good. Now I lost the video, so
Uh-oh, I can hear you very well.
but I can make it. I can make it louder.
That's good.
Is that okay? There you are. Now I can see everybody again.
Okay.
Yeah, nice to see you again. Nice to
Nice
see
to see you.
you. A lot of old friends. Yeah. I've been taking students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every year since 1995 until the pandemic sidelined us the last 2 years. So I've been there probably even more times than Canon has. And I always assign a few books for my students to read. And one that I've assigned every single time is John Hersey's Hiroshima. And I also assign it for other classes that I teach at American University. So this book is close to my heart in a lot of ways. But let me start off by putting it in some context. After the United States dropped the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Gallup did a poll of Americans and found that 85% of Americans approved of the atomic bombings. In a follow-up poll by Roper, we found that 23% of Americans said they wished the Japanese had not surrendered so quickly so the US could have dropped more atomic bombs on them. What we know is that the Japanese were the most hated foe the United States has ever fought against. The attitude in the United States, represented by Time and Newsweek, is that maybe the Japanese were human, but nothing indicates it. The American post-war image of the Japanese, or wartime image of the Japanese, was as insects or vermin or cockroaches or monkeys. And so the Americans, because of this attitude toward the Japanese, and also because of the attack at Pearl Harbor, also because of the information about the rape of Nanjing, the treatment of the prisoners during the Bataan Death March that comes out in 1944, the hatred toward the Japanese was very deep and heartfelt by many Americans. So when the US drops the bomb, the initial focus was not on what this was doing to the Japanese. The initial focus is, what can this possibly mean in the future for Americans? And the United States response was quite deep to the bombing. H.V. Kaltenborn at NBC Radio began his evening news broadcast that day. He said, Anglo-Saxon science has developed a new explosive 2,000 times as destructive as any known before. For all we know, we have created a Frankenstein. We must assume that with passage of only a little time, an improved form of the new weapon we use today can be turned against us. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch said, science may have signed the mammalian world's death warrant and deeded an earth in ruins to the ants. The Milwaukee Journal said that this could wipe out the planet. This goes on with the people and newspaper reports and magazine reports all over the country saying that this may doom the end of civilization. This may portend the end of humanity. And a newspaper after newspaper superimposed the effect of the atomic bomb on a map of their own cities, saying this could happen here, this could happen in Milwaukee, this could happen in Chicago, this could happen in Boston. So there was this universal sense of fear and foreboding, a sense of gloom. Edward R. Murrow said on his CBS radio news on August 12th, seldom if ever has a war ended leaving the victors with such a sense of uncertainty and fear, with such a realization that the future is obscure, that survival is not assured. Norman Cousins wrote about this primitive sense of fear that has swept the country. Even the Ladies' Home Journal, a publication that is not given to very serious coverage, Ladies' Home Journal wrote that, let me see. the Ladies Home Journal wrote that over in 1940, early 46, over and above all else you do, the thought you should wake up to, go to sleep with, and carry with you all day is the prevention of atomic war. That's the Ladies Home Journal. So the Americans did respond to this, but they didn't respond in terms of the Japanese or what the bombs had done from that kind of moral sense. They responded in terms of what this might mean for the future of the United States. And which is why the publication of Hiroshima by New York Magazine and John Hersey was so dramatically powerful, because now for the first time, it's going to humanize the Japanese victims by looking so closely at the 6 survivors whose lives intertwined. For the first time, as one college student wrote to New Yorker magazine, for the first time, I thought of the Japanese as human beings. The reaction, I could give several of the responses because they're so powerful. The mayor of Princeton in New Jersey said he wanted every citizen in Princeton to read the John Hersey article. Albert Einstein ordered 1,000 copies so that he could distribute them to American scientists. A young scientist who had been proud of his work on Manhattan Project said that he cried as he read the article. He said, "I was filled with shame to recall the whoopee spirit with which we and others had received the news of the atomic bombing." The responses like this go on. Norman Cousins wrote in the Saturday Review. He said, "Do we know, for example, that many thousands of human beings in Japan will die of cancer during the next few years because of radioactivity released by the bomb? Do we know that the atomic bomb is in reality a death ray, and that the damage by blast and fire may be secondary to the damage caused by radiological assault upon human tissue?" And that's very important because Hersey talked about the radioactivity. The Americans have been downplaying this. Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, had made several comments dismissing the threat of radioactivity. And he said, "Doctors told me that dying of radiation poisoning is a very pleasant way to die." Leslie Groves had the audacity to say that. So when Hersey is writing about the effects of radioactivity, when he's humanizing the victims, when he's talking about their suffering, when he's talking about the young girls, the students, when he's talking about people desperately begging others to help them, when he's talking about Reverend Kyoshi Tanimoto's experience and how he had to go by people begging, Tuskade, come and, help me. And he had to ignore them to try to find his wife and daughter. The deep humanizing of the victims for the first time had a very, very profound effect. And the New York Times even had an editorial that said, let me just read you a little of the Times editorial. "Every American who's permitted himself to make jokes about atom bombs or who has come to regard them as just one sensational phenomenon that can now be accepted as part of civilization, like the airplane and the gasoline engine, ought to read Mr. Hersey." The Times editorializer said, "The disasters at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were our handiwork. They were defended then and are now defended by the argument that they saved more lives than they took, more lives of Japanese as well as more lives of Americans. The argument may be sound or it may be unsound. One may think it's sound when he reads Tarawa, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. One may think it unsound when he reads Mr. Hersey." The Times went on to say, "History is history. It cannot be undone, but the future is still ours to help make." And that's what John Hersey book and article and book did. The Christian Century reviewer says, "Once in a lifetime, you read a magazine article that makes you want to bounce up out of your easy chair and go running around to your neighbors, thrusting the magazine under their noses, saying, read this, read it now. I mean, the responses that could go on for a long time, which I do with my students. Ruth Benedict said that Hiroshima by Hersey made it difficult to dismiss the negotiations of the atomic commissions, as if these statesmen were playing a mere impersonal game of diplomatic chess. For those who read it, she said, the issue has become scenes of burned and wounded staggering endlessly along the roads, of living burial under fallen timbers and rubble, of vomit and suppuration and lingering death. You know, so it made it very personal. I remember when my father gave me Hiroshima to read when I was 12 years old. You know, those images of the soldiers in Asano Park with their melted eyeballs dripping down their face, of Reverend Tanimoto having to remind himself these are human beings, as he tried to lift them onto the boat as their skin came off in sheets, are images that I don't think anybody can forget and that my students don't forget. But what we know is that society does forget. One of my students might be have joined us tonight, who just did a very interesting study about her generation, and a generation that's very sensitive and concerned about global warming, about racism, about gender issues, and the nuclear threat is completely off their radar again. And Robert Lifton has explained some of this in terms of nuclear numbing and the difficulty of dealing with the immediate threat to the continued existence of life on the planet. We know that there are two people alone who have veto power over the continued existence of life. That's Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. Either of them can end life on the planet in an instant. And we know that the threat of nuclear winter is more real than Sagan even understood back in the 80s. But the mythology surrounding the bomb is pervasive and incessant. When Susan Rice writes in the New York Times op-ed in 2019, following D-Day, my father was sent to the West Coast to prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater. He was spared combat by President Harry Truman's decision to drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, provoking the Japanese surrender. Or when Obama goes to Hiroshima, which I've been urging him to do from the day he got elected. And he goes there and he gives his talk at the cenotaph and he lies. And he lies with passive voice. And he says, death fell from the skies on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Death didn't fall from the skies. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs. And then he says, World War II reached its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's the lie. That's the myth. The myth is that the bombs ended the war and thereby not only saved American lives, but saved Japanese lives. Therefore, the bombs are not evil, not even a necessary evil. They are actually humane. The American was acting in a humane way. We see the same thing in Chris Wallace's best-selling book from last year. The reality, of course, the United States had 8 5-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 are on the record saying the atomic bombings were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. And nobody understood this better than Harry Truman. As little as Truman did understand, he knew this. And he refers to the intercepted telegram on July 18th, the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. And he says that after Stalin assured him that the Russians are coming into the war on schedule on July 17th, after their lunch, Truman writes in his journal, the Russians are, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. And he writes home to his wife, Bess, the next day, says the Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. Truman knew the bomb wasn't necessary to end the war, as did all the people around him. But the American people did not learn that. So 85% supported the atomic bombings. And they still don't know the truth. If I had time, I would subject you to the 12-hour lecture that I give. My students have to sit through.
It's great to hear you, Peter, and
Wonderful.
it's great to hear your stories, and your knowledge is so deep about John Hersey's work, and it's really such an honor to to be in this little digital space together with you, sharing some space again. I hope that we can share some time in real space soon, but it's wonderful to hear you tell it like it was. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So let's move on to our panel discussion. And yeah, I'd like to reintroduce Keiko-san, Keiko Tsuyama, and also Solly Granatstein. Those who you don't know them, or first time to see him, Keiko Tsuyama is a journalist based in New York City. She writes for prestigious publications such as Wall Street Journal Japan, IRA, Yahoo Japan, Business Insider, and many, many others. Her reporting varies on business, politics, and cultural features. And she covers Obama's presidential election from caucuses to inauguration. That was a very famous article. And her VIP interview includes Mark Zuckerberg, Eric Schmidt, Steve Chen, John Bolton, and Ted Turner, just to name a few. So that's Keiko-san, top journalist from Japan, and also a great friend of us, me and Canon, knows about our project since the very beginning. She was on the first day of filming with us. And Solly Granatstein, and he's a journalist and the TV producer in the United States. And he's been with CBS 60 Minutes programs, NBC News, ABC News, and he's also co-creator of American Divided, a documentary series about inequality. And he was also co-executive producer of The Years of Living Dangerously. He's a winner of 12 Emmys, a Peabody, a DuPont, 2 Polks, and for Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, and virtually every other major award in broadcasting journalism. So we're honored to have Solly and Keiko together and to have the deep discussion about the journalistic point of view on John Hersey's Hiroshima today. And Canon, why don't you start with you? Your journey, your understanding of John Hersey in Hiroshima. You have a very deep travel since 2014 into Hiroshima and beyond. So tell me your story first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I will probably try to focus more towards some current realities around John Hersey. I personally, my journey to Hiroshima was really initiated through Taku and my friendship and working on many different social enterprises together, education work.
And Takai-san made it possible.
That brought together art and social issues, and NHK and Takai-san, who I saw on the call earlier, actually encouraged really to look at John Hersey's story because of the importance to him as a journalist and as a television executive. You know, John Hersey had meant so much to him, and he saw younger generations, people under 40, even not knowing of the story, not knowing of the work. And I think that Takai-san really created a groundswell of awareness and interest that probably reached as far as Obama's team, certainly Caroline Kennedy and others sort of, hello Takai-san, certainly, you know, were inspired by what we were doing on television about John Hersey. And really, Taku and I spent about 6 months at the archives at Yale that have 128 boxes or something like that of John Hersey's papers. And, you know, as a grandson, you know, as someone who, my first editor was John Hersey, you know, telling me to memorize the dictionary as a way to become a good writer. You know, he was a tough critic, and I think it was very, you know, moving. My father and I were there. I was thinking of this just yesterday. My father and I were in Key West when he passed away, when he died. And I remember sitting with him just 3 days before he died, and him saying there were so many more stories left to tell. And just that, you know, that raw passion for the work of telling human stories, I think, was what motivated and moved him throughout his career, throughout his life, you know, whether they were well-known stories, presidential level stories. I mean, really telling a high-level presidential storytelling for the New Yorker, even of Truman himself. You know, about 6 years after Hiroshima was published, John Hersey was given the chance to do a long form article on Truman, and I just can only imagine how that went, but how that was initiated. But he was really, he cared about the human story. I mean, Taco and I went to Detroit, for instance, and followed John Hersey's writing on the Detroit race riots of 1967, and really listening to those teenage young men that had been their best friends killed in front of them by police, you know, seeing these same horrific incidents we're seeing today, he was writing on 40 years ago. And I think that what he was doing then is just something that we all can do today, which is really look deeper at the human story as an answer to our problems and our misunderstanding. Because just like at that time, it was the human story of those that suffered the atomic bombing in Hiroshima that John met and talked to and learned of their story, that he was able to share back out, to be a mirror to the world of that he heard, and to, you know, embody those feelings, those really difficult feelings and emotions and experiences, and to, you know, in the form of what was called new journalism, become the characters themselves and speak as if he were them to the world. And I think that was an incredible leap of faith and trust and sort of empathy. I think, having seen the whole war and seen so much suffering, I think it was for him enough is enough at a breaking point where just humanity had to start to think differently. And he was willing to risk his career at that time for that story. You know, there's been some great reporting coming out of Hiroshima about a recent document that was in the National Archive about U.S. Army General Groves reading the Hiroshima manuscript 2 weeks before it was published. And personally, Groves's handwritten notes are on that Hiroshima document that was just published through Chugoku Shimbun 2 days ago, or yesterday. And so I just want to honor that great reporting being done out of Chugoku Shimbun in Hiroshima. But, you know, I think that one thing that Taco and I found was, you know, and I'll end with this, is that the day before the article was to be published, you know, we came across this train ticket for my grandfather, my grandmother, my uncle, my father, and my aunt, kind of disappearing into North Carolina to the family house because of the knowledge that there would be an extreme backlash to the publishing of the story. And I just want to encourage all those journalists on the line that this is the time to stand up for what you believe in, because we need more John Herseys in the world, or more people willing to take that most deepest risk for what they believe in. And even at risk to family, to survival, to reputation, to career, you know, truth was the valuable asset at that time. And so, you know, to imagine from that time to this time that we would still be in this situation with nuclear weapons is shocking. You know, that we would not understand clearly the climate science of one nuclear weapon is dropped. It has a chance to destroy large amounts of human life on land and underwater, and we have the science to see these things. So it seems really like a fool's game to be at risk for the society's life, to have weapons and use them and rally more money and more spending towards keeping and cultivating these weapons of the planet's potential destruction. And so, you know, forward with the journalists. So let me just pass it off there. But it's great to be here together with all of you on this special day in our family. And I feel like you're all part of that. So
Wonderful.
Thank you for joining us.
Great. Yeah, I want to, you know, keep on talking about the journalistic, you know, John Hersey clearly had the sense of mission that this has to be reported. Specifically because of the restriction set by White House, Truman White House, and the MacArthur GHQ. So against all grain, he did it, and it still resonates with us. So Keiko-san, I want to pass it on to you. What would you think about the book Hiroshima Impact and Relevance Today? Oh, you're on mute right now.
Yes, I am a journalist, and then I'm a 30-year experienced journalist. But I would love to add a very humane face of our job, and John Hersey as well. So 30 years ago, back in 1990 and in 91, I was based in Nagasaki as a reporter of Kyodo News, which is the largest news agency in Japan, which is equivalent to the Associated Press in the United States. And so I had a lot of opportunities to talk to meet with Hibakusha, which is the atomic bomb survivors. I was a crime reporter for the first year, and the second year I was covering the city hall. So all the time, for the both beats, I had to contact with atomic bomb survivors associations groups, which there were 3 to 4 back in those days, and I was calling them all the time. But I was 24 years old, 25 years old. I was so young and naive. So back then, I didn't know what to talk with them, how to talk with them. I was calling them and then visiting them to talk about what the associations were doing, and then I didn't talk about normal thing like what sake you like, or what the pleasure you have, what you are doing at the spare time, stuff like that, because I was really concerned that because they've been through so hard times, and I was concerned that I didn't want to bother them to talk about these hard things over and over again for new reporters, whose feet were wet. And so I was, very shy. But I am absolutely regretful about that. Still now, I'm very traumatized. How I was like that back then. They were early 60s, and they were genki, they were fine. So I really wanted to talk more, and then to get to know more about them, but I couldn't do that. But John Hersey did it. He really could connect with them, and I am Japanese, but I couldn't connect with the atomic bomb survivors back in 1990 and in 91. But John Hersey did it back in 1946, 9 months later, that the United States dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. And he was not Japanese. He was tall, skinny, very pale reporter visiting Hiroshima. And he was just shared so many things with the people over there back then. And then it was only like within 2 weeks. So I really adore him because he was so brave, courageous to talk to people and to connect with people, to help them share their hardest stories from the very horrible incidents that happened to them, and then that affected them for the whole life. So I really, really admire John Hersey as a person, and then also as a journalist who could achieve that kind of work and an endeavor while he was doing his covering and reporting in Hiroshima.
Wonderful. I think as a journalist, we sometimes, actually, a lot of times, we have to deal with trauma, right? The individual trauma, family trauma, sometimes societal trauma. And I think nuclear issue is exactly that. Canon, do you have any reaction to what Keiko said about trauma, John Hersey? You're on mute right now.
I certainly, looking through the documents and the approach. I mean, we were speaking about this yesterday. He was writing for Life magazine based out of Hong Kong for about 6 months before arriving to Hiroshima. He had left working with Time, where he'd been asked to be the editor-in-chief 3 times by Henry Luce, who had turned him down, and he'd written only one article for the New Yorker at this point, which was sort of the well-known PT 109 story on JFK, sort of celebrating JFK's heroism during World War II. And John Hersey found himself in northern China, in China post-war, really writing about just the ravishes of wartime, that there was darkness all around, that all sides carried blame, and that there was just, seeing China at that time was just a raw and open wound. Northern China, Korean Peninsula. And then he was given permission to travel to Japan. And we really found the little envelope and really all the handwritten notes. We had found some very special letter that really connected John Hersey to the U.S. Army, the standing general, General Eichelberger. That was really through a family connection in the Cannon family and my grandmother's family. And it was really my grandmother that connected John Hersey to the opportunity to enter Hiroshima. And we found a little envelope with all the handwritten notes. It was really through God, through priests, through spirit. We found a top secret document from the US Army that was an Italian priest really telling what had happened in Hiroshima. And we were in the archive at Yale. All of these documents exist and are there for anyone to go and visit. But it was really like following an incredible treasure map, of journalism, of the 21st century journalism, and really seeing all the steps he took was quite amazing. And I think for him, it was just, he was a person born in China. He'd seen a lot of brutality in China, between Japan and China. I think that he went to Japan, he saw a lot of brutality that had happened to Japanese people, and he felt it should be spoken about, not as enemy or as friend or foe. It was just as human. I think he wanted to tell that human story. And I think that that's how he went into Hiroshima, was really as a tall white guy, but who spoke Mandarin Chinese before he spoke English. He really didn't look at Asian people as that different than himself. I mean, I thought when I went to China the first time when I was 18, I'd be embraced as a wayward son coming home to China. And as a tall white man, it didn't really happen that way either. But I think when you go into conversations open-hearted and you hear people fully, even if you can't understand their language, you can really hear, you can allow space for people to tell their story. And I think that was what John Hersey knew how to do very well. So.
Yeah, to touch upon the a little bit of what we need more John Hersey. Cannon said before that we need more John Hersey to reveal the truth, but to reveal the truth is very hard. It takes a while, but I think we need more John Hersey because we need, like all of us can acquire some kind of, ability and then empathy to be able to talk to anybody, in anybody who is in a horrible situation, who escaped from war zones or conflicts, or LGBTQ, or who were suffer from COVID, because we were surrounded by so many crises nowadays. But it's not only the journalist jobs that can be connected with people, in troubles or in hard times. And so we need more John Hersey in nowadays, in a way of to communicate with people. We need more John Hersey to reveal and then to tell the truth first, but to second, to be able to talk to anybody. After all, we are everybody is a human being, So I would love to add that perspective to Cannon's comments.
Thank you, Keiko.
Wonderful. So I want to change gear to Solly, and you've been knowing Canon a long time, and so you know our project since the very beginning. So, this time it's about John Hersey, Hiroshima. But what would you think about the relevancy of those stories and attitude of John Hersey as a journalist, as a human being?
Yeah, thanks, Taku. I mean, first, I just want to say what an honor it is to be on this panel and part of this conversation. And thanks to you, Taku, and Cannon. I mean, I feel very inspired by Cannon's courage, especially to go back and retrace his grandfather's steps, and his doggedness, in investigating that story and really keeping on that one story, because it is such an important story for us all to actually pay attention to. And it was so influential to me. I mean, I hadn't actually read Hiroshima until I was well into my career, actually. But at the same time, I can see how that book and this work was so influential to the path of my career and the path of my journalism. There's just, first of all, I was growing up in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s, and nuclear weapons were such an important backdrop to my childhood. Everyone was very focused on the threat of nuclear war and nuclear winter, and the disarmament movement was actually, sort of a really important phenomenon when I was a kid. And then, so that was the backdrop, but also the new journalism that I really see John Hersey as being a founder of, one of the founding fathers of this kind of journalism. And there's just, when I did read Hiroshima, there's just so much to admire in the book. I mean, it's technically it's great writing, this idea of narrative journalism that reads like a novel, and has suspenseful storytelling, but also his courage to go somewhere where he might be hated, right, which was clear, right, and the idea that you would connect with traumatized people and let them tell you their stories, and actually have a kind of healing through storytelling. And his courage to resist patriotism, which others have alluded to here. But how difficult that must have been in 1945, 1946 to actually humanize Japanese people as an American in the immediate aftermath of the war. I mean, it's truly tremendous, considering that the hostility to Japanese Asians, in general, just went on for decades after that. And just the unflinching way that he related really unbearable facts, and the meticulous reporting of those facts, the meticulous reporting of the details of these people's lives, which was another way to really humanize them. Exactly what they went through in the moments leading up to the atomic bomb, and in all the moments and the days and months afterward. It's kind of like undeniable reporting. Like the undeniable humanity of that kind of meticulous reporting. And I think it's important to recognize Hiroshima as a deeply anti-racist work, which I think is really, this is probably the most debilitating sickness in American society, in Western society, and maybe in certain ways throughout the world, is this sickness of racism, and treating other people, especially people who don't look like you, having this capacity to dehumanize them. And it was mentioned that John Hersey actually grew up in China, so and that he had this capacity to basically not necessarily recognize the same difference that that so many Americans did at the same time. So he was actually perfectly placed to go to Hiroshima and tell this story. In terms of my own work and my own career, I'll just go through a few of the experiences that I've had, which I think were really influenced by John Hersey's example, and the example of this work in particular. One of the first stories that I ever produced for 60 Minutes, or the first one I ever produced for 60 Minutes, was this interview with Wen-Ho Lee, who was a Chinese American nuclear scientist who was suspected of being a spy on behalf of the Chinese government, even though actually he was from Taiwan. And there was no real evidence against him, but nevertheless, he was arrested and actually held in solitary confinement. And this guy, there's no reason to hold him in solitary confinement. He was the most meek, most shy, unassuming person that you've ever come across. And he was definitely ethnically profiled because he was Chinese American, and this was in the mid 90s, and there were hearings in Congress about technology transfer to China of military secrets, and he was just swept up in that. And there's really no evidence that of any nuclear leak, leak of nuclear secrets that was actually tied to him, and yet he was incarcerated for quite a while. And the evidence ended up being so flimsy that the judge, when it came to the pretrial hearings, the judge threw out every single count. There were 100 counts against him, and the judge threw out every single count. So that was, and I think that was, somehow that was influenced by John Hersey's example. And I guess like John Hersey in the New Yorker, I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to go to foreign countries and report on the human condition and work for organizations that by and large supported this kind of reporting. But sometimes I would say the pressure of the American public, I could really feel it, when you reported on certain kinds of stories. Like I did a story on civilian casualties in Afghanistan as a result of U.S. airstrikes, and there was a really keen anxiety and that was for 60 Minutes, and there was a really keen anxiety within 60 Minutes over that story. My bosses were worried about that story. They were worried that it would somehow cut us off from access to the U.S. military to do embeds with them, to do reporting that would be in concert with them. So that was, one example. We did a story called The Killings at Haditha about the massacre of Iraqi civilians in Haditha, Iraq by US Marines. And we had an exclusive interview with the squad leader of the Marines who was charged with the most murders and who killed the most Iraqi civilians. He killed kids and women and old people who obviously were non-combatants. And the stack of mail that we received, who basically were attacking us at 60 Minutes for exposing that afterwards, was really amazing. And the hostility that that came our way as a result of reporting that story and just asking tough questions of this guy who had killed all these people was really, really stunning. And it just just makes you wonder about the American people and about makes you see that really not that much has changed since the time when 23% of people told a Gallup poll that they wished that they had more chance to bomb Japan before the surrender, as the professor was telling us.
Yeah, I would say that even when we made our film in 2015, a New York Wall Street Journal article came out, really mostly about John Hersey's Hiroshima and how that had been a model for the Wall Street Journal coverage and of 9/11, that had been what the Wall Street Journal editor asked the reporters to think of as they told the 9/11 story. And they made a video, and we were part of that because we were in Hiroshima making our film at the time with Koko Kondo, the only living member of John Hersey's Hiroshima, who is sort of like an aunt to us and is really, all of us, Peter and Taku and Takai-san and all of us, she's been kind of like an auntie to us in terms of bringing us closer to the Hiroshima story. But I think that when that article came out, within 6 hours, there was almost 250 hate messages on that about how could you talk about Hiroshima in this light. I mean, it was amazing to witness as a journalist trying to and an artist. We were having a big public event in Times Square the next day, and it's scary when you're sort of seeing all of this anger and aggression. And
right.
As a child who I lived in the Dakota, and John Lennon was shot on my doorstep, when I was 5 years old. It's amazing what happens to peaceful people in this world and people who kind of stand for something different. But it shouldn't stop us from standing for something different also. But it certainly is a lot to consider.
Yeah. And I mean, the history of racist suppression, just continues in this country, in the political system and in society. I mean, just today, the Texas legislature passed this voter suppression law to make it harder for people to vote. And it's just a continuation of the voter suppression that has continued since right after the Civil War. As soon as Blacks got the right to vote in the United States, there were efforts to keep them from voting. So these kinds of that man's inhumanity to man, but especially along racial lines in America, has really just continued unabated, and it's just I feel like it's an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing fight to expose the truth. It's an ongoing fight to try to see things clearly, right? To actually, go and bear witness and gather as many facts and report as many facts as possible. Which is definitely the example of John Hersey's Hiroshima. And I'll also say that this, sort of the exposure of the threat of nuclear annihilation is just something that is so deep, and so deeply related to climate change. This other threat to the human species by our own hand. And you know, I was looking at Hiroshima last night, and you know, came across this description of like a fire tornado.
Mm.
And these are actually, this is the same thing that we're reading about now. Actually, in some of the Western forest fires, there are fire tornadoes. And I've spoken with people who have witnessed fire tornadoes and reporting about climate change. You know, it's like it just keeps going.
Yeah, I think we're touching upon two important points that Canon and I and Takai-san and everybody involved in that documentary about the relevancy of John Hersey's work, Hiroshima and John Hersey's life. It was 2015, but I think the same is true now. One is there is government narrative. Sometimes it's a cover-up, censorship. Uncover it, you know, no matter what. I think that's the value, very big value of Hiroshima. That's why the piece Hiroshima is voted #1 journalistic work of American journalism of the 20th century. So that's one thing. The other thing is like one that Solly just talked about is humanizing stories. I think every war, every conflict, every side taking start with dehumanizing the others. Yeah. Those are the others. They are not worthy. We can kill them. That's what always happens. And sometimes we journalists, we media, help that narrative. You know, people hate that country. Like we know there's a tension between China and United States, China and Japan, China and Korea. We saw such narrative raging right after 9/11. Islam, anything who have dark color skin, speaks, Islamic language, are terrorists. It used to be a narrative, crafted narrative by Bush administration. Now these days, it's not even the crafted narrative. It's like a direct attack to others. So I think humanizing those stories show the real truth of people, not categorized or colored others, but reinforcing this is humans.
Right.
With human stories, human lives. It's your uncle, it's your aunt, it's your doctor, reverend. I think that's the unwavering and not aging effect of Hiroshima, I think. What do you think?
Maybe it's hard, to kind of like, in the age of written words, you could read these words and imagine these people like people you knew.
Mm.
But in the age of media, you see these people that look different than you and you immediately judge them. And I think that in this time, whether it's algorithm, whether it's technology that judges us as we even look at it, to analyze our preferences of advertising, or, we're getting put into boxes of people similar to us. And I think that that's a big part of the problem too, because there's no reason why young journalists wouldn't fall in love with the career path of Keiko Suyama as someone to admire, who is from small town America. But in this time and place, that's probably not happening very much, and I think that, for me, let's say, becoming a mentor to young people in Hiroshima was not necessarily something that I anticipated, as an artist and an organizer going to Hiroshima to make a film 7 years ago. But, 28 visits later, Hiroshima is like a second home, and somewhere that I feel like I have to keep revisiting in order to keep up relationships with friends who are mentors like Coco or Takai-san, and people who have been, that are mentees that I work to raise up, as the next generation. And I think, Keiko, you said it right. We kind of have to open ourselves up to these conversations more often, and try to open up, those that have the potential to do so, open up those conversations into popular media and into popular distributed television and magazine press. And it's you know, people were amazed that we were able to do our work on Hiroshima. You know, even my father speaking about some of the fragile story between China and Japan and how John Hersey grew up in China and had a, you know, there was a lot of sensitive issues in there, not often spoken about on NHK, that we were allowed to address because it was John Hersey whose legacy we were addressing. And I think that we should try to, you know, like you were saying, Taku, you know, where there's easy methods to kind of put a dark shadow on a people or a race or an other to you, always kind of look for that opportunity to find what's common between you and that person. Kind of, Keiko, like you were talking about being in Nagasaki, like you didn't really realize how to like have that conversation about what was a survivor's favorite sake or favorite wine, or what was their favorite dress, or what made them feel beautiful on a Friday night, you know, because everyone wants to feel special. And that was kind of, for me as an artist, like one of the ways that I went in was to really like try to hear and see and be tangibly in dancing, in dialogue with, you know, as a visual artist, that's kind of my practice, is to try to get close to those things that make you feel special as someone different than me, and then how that relates to my life journey, and then try to depict that, to be a mirror back to those people whose stories are being given to me, you know. And I think that with television, working so closely with Taku, it was an incredible opportunity to do that. And I would like to kind of point out with Sally, you know, with America Divided, I feel like you were doing that in America itself, you know, going out to Flint, Michigan, to people who haven't had safe drinking water in our country and is still not repaired, you know, and really bringing those stories out to the light to American audiences and saying, you know, through celebrity hosts. So you found the way to articulate to the largest popular audience these human stories that were really not being paid proper attention to. And you tried to really bring that celebrity into personal contact with the human story. And I just want to sort of point to that. And also, Sally, maybe if you want to touch on what that was like at that time. And
yeah, I mean, that I guess that series, America Divided, it was about inequality of wealth and power, but it was trying to do the same thing as the new journalism in terms of telling the stories of submerged populations or marginalized populations, in a number of different contexts. So we were in Flint, Michigan. We had a story about what it was like to live as an undocumented person in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, where there are so many undocumented people, what it was like to be displaced in New York City, actually, sort of, and also to be the victim of racial discrimination in housing in New York City. We like you were saying, Cannon, we had sort of celebrity hosts, correspondents. Norman Lear was one of the executive producers of that series, and he was also a correspondent. And he came back to New York and was actually investigating housing discrimination and took part in this housing test where both he and an elderly African-American gentleman went to the same apartment building looking for an apartment, and were treated completely differently. Not because it was Norman Lear, he was not recognized, but because it was a white guy and a black guy. And it was so we were just trying to use all the tools of storytelling to kind of bring these stories of of really extreme inequality within the United States, and sort of and real suffering that none of us should actually be putting up with in our own country, so that was the point of that series. And I think the whole idea was just to try to humanize and create a feeling of empathy through the eyes of these celebrities, so that each of them was experiencing these stories through their own biography and their own emotionality. Norman Lear, just to give one example, his father was actually incarcerated for a big part of his childhood, and so by actually suffering that in his boyhood, he really does have a lot of empathy, I think, for people in general. And our correspondents were people who had all been through various difficult things in their lives, whether it was Jesse Williams or Rosario Dawson, like all these people who had actually experienced racism themselves. So that's basically what that series was about. And I definitely think that it's following in the tradition that John Hersey started.
So I would like to shine a little light on Taku Nishimai too. He's playing the MC here very well and smoothly, but also a top journalist, for 35-year veteran, telling dynamic stories about climate change, about the Hibakusha and the Hiroshima survivors, and economic journalism, many, many different facets over many years about what's wrong in the world, and a few things that are fixing or solutions. But Taku, I wanted to sort of look back at some of your past work, especially like the Peabody Award-winning War Tales, and kind of hear, how you see War and Peace in this time. You have a very unique perspective on the darkness of it, and how do you foresee yourself in your next 35 years of your career? How do you see yourself impacting the world of journalism?
Well, thank you so much. I didn't expect this, but let me be brief. But this is me and you, Canon. We took this journey since 2014. Well, since 2008-9, we've been working together. But really, from Hiroshima visit and making this documentary, Hiroshima Revealed, thanks to Takai-san and NHK, that was really a game changer for me. But since 1988, I'm making films, and as a documentary filmmaker and as a journalist, you deal with trauma. I've been to post-Pol Pot era Cambodia, did a lot of stories about children who had to kill their parents. We did, we went to South Africa together. We listened to survivors of apartheid. It's very recent, only 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it ended. So we deal with trauma, and we started to see, by making documentaries, especially this Hiroshima Revealed, I started to see the similarity, the common ground. Why do we do this? It's not just US-Japan piece of history in Pacific War, it's human condition, especially nuclear bomb is a human condition. And why we do this? It's about how, Paul Miller put it, it's arrogance of human beings to nature. We can use everything and destroy everything. And also, as we, me and Solly were talking about the dehumanizing factor, that when government or big corporations or anyone who's interested in power use it to eliminate, dehumanize the others, to make them the unworthy victim. They can die for us. And I just remembered the presentation that Akira Kawasaki and Emily Macron, our friend at ICANN, did last year. All these hibakushas around the world, not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but hibakushas around the world, nuclear testing in South Pacific specifically, and all those places that has hibakusha are colonies. They are the colonies, they're the unworthy people who can be the guinea pig of testing of nuclear bombs. So I think that's a pattern we see again and again, including nuclear power plant. It's built on the remote places. That's dispensable people. You die for us. I think that's the society we built, unfortunately. We live on that. Our civilization is about taking advantage of others. And in order to do that, in order to invade other countries, in order to take somebody's land, we dehumanize those people. And we see that again and again. The racism is a prime example in the United States and elsewhere, that people who have a darker skin or different religion, we can show them as the others and make them unworthy. And that's the narrative people with themselves, and sometimes media strengthen those narratives. So as you said, Canon, we need more John Hersey, and we're not just talking about journalists and writers. Everybody, if you're a teacher, if you are an entrepreneur, if you are a steel worker, anyone who's interested in making the world better ought to have John Hersey within themselves. Don't dehumanize others. Don't make enemies, but see it as human beings and find the common ground rather than differences. So that's the biggest learning block. And I wanna hand my button to Keiko. I know we worked together on the Picadon project around 2004, 5, 6, 10. And we did a lot of projects together with Kuroda Seitaro and others. And you're always there, and you've been reporting about others, the women's rights, the racism. You're always in the place where people are oppressed and do a wonderful reporting. So what does it to you to make that kind of report, Keiko-san?
I just wanted to do it. But for the relevancy of John Hersey's work, Hiroshima, and I just want to point out that John Hersey had a great editor and a publisher, and you always need someone to understand what you are doing. And I was really lucky. Ever since I became a freelance journalist after leaving Kyoto News 15 years ago, I always had someone to stand by me and understand why my reporting is important and relevant, and why some readers have wanted to read my stories. So that became a kind of my own brand. So again, you pointed out, we want to have more John Hersey to understand the other person's point of view and existence, and then also the humanize everyone. That's what you need with whom you are working with as well. So, for example, when I was with Kyoto News, Nissan Renault announced that they want to buy General Motors, and I wrote the breaking news. And my editor in Tokyo just called me and, Tsuyama-san, is it true? Is it true? So I was really disappointed that, I didn't have the back of, what I was reporting. Yes, it is unbelievable that Nissan Renault, which is the joint venture of Nissan Motors in Japan and then France's Renault, was going to buy General Motors, which didn't happen. But you always need someone who trusts you and who trusts your sense of journalism. And then I think in terms of John Hersey's Hiroshima, which you all know that only 3 persons were working on the this long 30,000 words reportage for weeks secretly, and that is amazing. And then that's another beautiful story about beautiful aspect about Hiroshima.
Well, I would say that there's what I heard was that my grandmother had actually typed most of the manuscript from the phone. So as usual, the woman at the party was left out of the history book. But
Oh no!
I would like to say we need more Keiko Tsuyamas more than we need more John Herseys at this point. But I would just like to say, Keiko, tell us some of what you're working on right now, and as we kind of look forward, what are we doing as individuals about this, the changing story, the changing dynamic, the inequality, So Keiko, just give us a couple of your upcoming projects. We'd love to hear what you're thinking about.
Yes, thank you for asking. I'm writing about Kamala Harris right now, but it's not only about her. I am adding the history of women in the United States and the African Americans, and also all kinds of minorities like LGBTQ, queer, just to show how important that vice presidency of Kamala Harris in this country. And it happened here, but I also would like to see it happen in Japan and elsewhere as well. So it's an ongoing project, but Shueisha, which is one of the biggest publishers in Japan, is going to publish the book about my project next year, 2022. I am excited to do this because I think it's my first book. I published 7 books already, but it's the very first book that will feature, that is really humane, has the really humane aspects, insights, thoughts about the world. And I am really blessed that I could work on this project.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. Looking forward to that.
And Sally, what do you have coming up? What are you looking out at when you look ahead? What stories are you trying to tell?
Well, I can't really talk about that. No. There's I can mention a couple of things. There's a series on Vice TV that's upcoming called While the Rest of Us Die, which is it's actually season 2 of that series, which is a series. It's a documentary series about oligarchy, and basically how the oligarchy takes care of itself while the rest of us die. When the shit hits the fan, the rest of us can perish while the very powerful and the very wealthy take care of themselves. And there is actually, to answer a question that somebody put in the chat, one of the episodes of that series is actually about the legacy of the nuclear arsenal and the threat of the nuclear arsenal. So look for that on Vice TV this fall, starting in September. And I'm developing a series about cases of people who are killed by police, unarmed people who are killed by police, which is called Deadly Force. And then there's just a generalized TV news magazine that we're developing, hoping that we'll get a green light on that really soon.
Beautiful.
But so those are a few of the things.
Well, always looking forward to seeing your next work, and also the first time to get to work together on John Hersey's story together.
Well, I was gonna say, there's also this exciting idea that we came up with yesterday, which is, I mean, that would be tremendous.
And Taku, what are we working on tomorrow?
Well, we've been working on many things, but specifically, that was a very deep experience working with Buchanan and learning about John Hersey very, very deeply. The first encounter with John Hersey was when I was 17. I was an exchange student in the United States, Tacoma, Washington. U.S. history teacher, Mr. Barker, gave me this book and read this, and we're going to talk about this book next week. That was Hiroshima by John Hersey. That was 1981. Everyone reads Hiroshima in classroom, in U.S. history class, and we talked about it. So that really changed my perspective. Sadly, I didn't know about the book, and I didn't know much about what happened in Hiroshima until I read that book. So that really changed my life and led to what I do today, making documentaries and telling stories. But making Hiroshima Review together with you, Canon, has given me a very deep sense of how we can tell stories in a polyphonic way. It's not just I or you telling the stories, but we had hibakshas telling stories. We have Koko-san telling wonderful stories. We have so many characters, but bind them together, and that's John Hersey's method. We learned deeply about how John did it together with 6 main characters. There are many sub-characters in the one little book. It's not a little book, the big book. And we tried to do that. And I think we succeeded at some point that there are many stories, but it's bound together thanks to John Hersey's mastery, which is about humanizing stories. And one last thing before we close this and open up the floor to the Q&A is that I was very impressed with you, Canon, that you took this journey. It was tough. You were there for the first time in Hiroshima and listening to Hibakusha's stories for the first time. It was a traumatic experience. I've been through that when I was younger. And you found John's life there, how he did it in 1946, May. Only for 2 weeks, he was there listening to those stories intensively and wrote that piece. And he was silent, total silent after he wrote the book. He never talked about the book, or he never talked about the experience from Hiroshima. And you found that as like an inherited trauma. How did you put it? That's the deep discovery our documentary achieved.
Yeah, I would say that that it was sort of my understanding as we went through the process. John only returned once to Hiroshima in 1985, almost 40 years later. I think that, we came across hundreds of invitation letters to return to Hiroshima after writing the book, or to return to Japan, and he did not. And I think that also there was not a press conference, there was never interviews. He really just avoided talking about the work and asked that the work be taken on its own words, and that it not be that he not explain the book, but that the book explain itself and explain the survivors' experiences. I think, I think a lot of that came out of the trauma that he sort of took on in the process of the interviews, of the 2 weeks of intensive interviews with 30 people, to find 6 stories that he would put into the book Hiroshima. I think that he took on the stories to such a degree to tell them as the first person, as if it was I, that I think he suffered what many survivors suffered, which is an inability to talk about this traumatic experience. And I think that the only time he ever did a press conference was in Hiroshima when he visited 40 years later, because he felt it would have been disrespectful to Chugoku Shimbun and to the people of Hiroshima to not answer the questions of the press. But that was the only interview that he ever conducted on Hiroshima. And I think that, it's a very difficult trauma to deal with. I think personally, I wanted to make sure that I didn't do what he did, which was come in and do my work leave and not come back for 40 years. I felt like, my time was different. It wasn't such a traumatic time. There had been 70 years in between the atomic bomb and now. And I felt like I wanted to work through the initial meetings and learning and hearing and feeling some of that darkest pain, but also to really look for beyond that trauma, the hope and the innovation and the joy of Hiroshima. And I think that Hiroshima, to me, I always say, is not the city that suffered humans' worst brutality, but is a city that is filled with hope and innovation and new dreams and compelling people and creatives and individuals and business people and storytellers. And so Hiroshima went from being a very dark historical memory to being a place of hope to me and a place of innovation. And that's sort of been the Hiroshima that I hope to share more with the world. I think it's easier to tell the dark story because if it bleeds, it leads often. But I think that we have to keep doing our best, as Keiko said, to kind of go out there and hear people for their best self, and then mirror that out to the world and let people see those things that they're not offered the opportunity to see often.
Wonderful. Exactly. So I'd like to, what time is 11:30 now, 10:30 p.m. now. So I'd like to have a few questions from the audience. There are many wonderful people here. And Tanya, you have a question? So maybe you can, I ask you to unmute, and maybe you can ask that question. Tanya, is that okay? Tanya is a professor at Wilmington College, peace education, wonderful educator there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just come from a completely layperson's understanding of the press and sort of the process of reporting, but I'm just wondering what pressures reporters or journalists might face either in telling or not telling stories about American nuclear weapons productions and arsenals, especially at the very mainstream level, CBS, NBC, ABC, and then perhaps some of the other larger media conglomerates.
I would say just quickly, there's a growing interest in the major networks. I think when we first started doing this work in 2015, it was really a hard no and a sort of a slam door in the face, typically, when there was the conversation of should we revisit the Hiroshima storytelling. The response from US media was pretty cold in general. I would say that this year we even got a lot of inquiries coming in from the major broadcasters, taking time to really review our material and even putting out stories. The last 2 years, you've had sort of main national broadcasters in the US telling human stories of the great artist Tanaka-san in Hiroshima, or you saw the story of the survivor trees with Tomoko Watanabe on NBC, a minute and a half. These are just little tastes. They're not doing feature-length documentary storytelling on John Hersey, but they are telling the human story. And some of the more important stories that we've been telling, they're sort of consolidating and telling on some mainstream US press. I think that, there's been 2 books published in the last year about John Hersey's Hiroshima or about John Hersey, Mr. Straight Arrow, about John Hersey, and then the book Fallout by Leslie Bloom, which has been gathering a lot of attention in the last year. And I think there's more and more interest in sort of getting to the bottom of why are people attacking Asian people on American streets, and why are we still at this place in how we deal with each other and how we treat each other. Yeah. And I think that that's forcing the news media and the national media to really take a look at their practices also and say, well, how can we look at these stories differently? And how can we make more space for a myriad of voices that really represent the American or the global fabric? You know, like these are the human stories that represent this country, and these are the human stories that represent the global world, the people on the planet. And so I think there's a change, but I don't know, Taku, how do you feel? From NHK, from what you understand of the global media, what do you see?
Yeah, as Soli mentioned, there is obvious pressure, or whatever. We in Japan we call it kuki, the air. That hey, you shouldn't talk about those things in that term. There is some conventional wisdom sometimes, but I think it's changing. And I wanna bring in 高井さん。高井さん、ちょっとよろしいですか？せっかくいらっしゃってるので、ちょっと無茶ぶりなんですけれども、You made it possible for us to make that documentary, and you are the editor for us. You know, we were not really top level, but you were the top level, and you gave us a great guidance to tell the story of John Hersey. What would you think of the relevancy and the importance of John Hersey's Hiroshima and telling the story, humanized story that way?
Yes. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It's great to see you all and the Professor Peter Kaznick. Very nice to see you again. And so I'm also great to know Sori Grandsteins. It's my first time to meet you. You know, so I'm currently assuming a position as the managing director of NHK World Japan, which is international the branch of NHK, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. And so before moving to NHK World, I was the senior producer for World Documentary, and I love to watch the World Documentary, like Years of Living Dangerously. So I actually acquired the series of the Years of Living Dangerously, and also the Untold Story of the United States, written by Peter Kaznick and Olga Stone. But so as to your question about John Hersey's Hiroshima, so yeah, actually I have been working with the Canon and Taku for years, since 2015, when we produced the story of Hiroshima Revealed, and then moved to Detroit, Revealed, and Survivor Trees. It's great to have that kind of a story for NHK World and for international audiences. And also, I think the importance of the Hiroshima story is now, so we're increasing because so NHK World has special relations with PBS channels in the United States, especially you can see the NHK World on sub-channel of WNET and JPBS in New York area, as well as MPT, Maryland Public Television in Washington area, Great Washington area. So I have producer director background. So I actually produced when I moved to NHK World, which is international channel. So I produced several stories dealing with the atomic bombing on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, so PBS has a kind of distribution network of APT, American Public Television. So I actually at NHK World pitched the program related to atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And they accept those programs and appeared on the PBS main channels. So, so most the people is now knowing about the importance of atomic bombing and, why so the United States dropped atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki before the end of World War II. As Peter Kaznick said, it's a great story. And so I think so we should produce that kind of story on Hiroshima, incorporated by, the Canon and Taku And also, yeah, as the managing director, I'm doing the story of environmental issues like, the climate change. Yeah, Hersey has already produced a wonderful story of years of living dangerously. So I as a producer, so would like to produce a kind of story of atomic bombing and also climate change issues. Is that okay, Missy?
Yes. Yeah, that's what we are working on, climate change, human
Yeah.
rights. We did the Detroit Revealed in 2017, 50 years after the Detroit uprising. The same method, John Hersey's book, his words and action dehumanizing Black people at that time. And we're working on Mississippi Revealed since last year, and it's about voting rights, which is the hottest subject right now in the United States. Again, John Hersey wrote the story in 1964 in the heat of voter suppression. So very similar story, but make it relevant to today's issue with John's writing. That's what we do, yeah?
I think that kind of the interesting thing about that story, Taco, about Mississippi Revealed, which was based on an article of Vote for a Life, was that John Hersey went and lived on a farm with a small farmer and learned what it was like to be African American in Mississippi in the early 60s. And it was really, again, that human process, that spending time, not in a rushed process, but making time to sit where no one else would sit and hear a story of what Sally, you were talking about as the unworthy victim, the sort of what we call the shadow people, or those that are unheard, and I think that's the process of journalism, is to go and hear those stories, and I think around climate change, it's these people that are suffering based on the decisions of a powerful few. They're the ones who are going to suffer the worst burden of climate change. And I think getting out and hearing those stories, I think nuclear survivor stories are climate change related stories. And I think that's one of the things that we've been really looking to bring together, is the climate movement and the nuclear free world movement. Because until that's seen as a connected problem, we'll continue to seek resources and other people to seek resources, and we're talking in silos. But really, if there's ever a nuclear bomb dropped, it'll be the worst environmental catastrophe ever experienced on the planet. And I don't think that we clearly see the damage done by the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki either from a climate perspective. I don't think we ever really unpack that. And I think that I would say that that's a call to action to Kaisan for you, is that I think that you're one of the few people that can ask that be done, and make sure it's done, and I think that we're here working for that. And yeah, it's great to, you really lead the way, and it's been great seeing you go at climate change in a way that you went at nuclear stories, the Hiroshima stories, the Fukushima stories. I mean, you talked about these things that other people just wouldn't talk about, and people were judging the Japanese people as not talking about Fukushima stories or not talking about Hiroshima stories. But, seeing your brave journalism too has been really important to us. I mean, it made it possible for us to do our work. So obviously we're happy about that. But beyond that, it's always inspiring coming into the headquarters in Tokyo and seeing all the young, new, progressive, primarily women, going to work to put an end to these man problems to some degree. But anyway, it's great to see you.
ありがとうございました. Thank you so much, Takai-san. And I have to honor one other very important people who made our journey possible. Komizo-san, from I think he's in Tokyo, but he was the chairman, Rijicho of the Peace Culture Center of Hiroshima, who are in charge of the museum and all this peace culture initiative out of Hiroshima. And he's been our wonderful friend. And I'd like to ask you, Komizo-san, what's your impression and what it means to you to learn about Hiroshima and about John Hersey's Hiroshima?
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank Taku and Canon to invite me to join this great discussion. And of course, John Hersey is a great figure with truth, humanitarianism, humanism, and courage as a journalist. And that still influences many, great journalists we have in front of us right now. And I am very much impressed also that his grandson, Canon Hersey, as artist, together with journalists, are really kind of spreading what his grandfather trying to achieve. And that is quite amazing. And I feel great that John Hersey must have been pleased that his grandson is actually doing this right now. And our work is actually humanity versus inhumanity, and inclusiveness versus divisiveness, and truth versus demagogy. And we need a courage to unite humanity, because all human being has a right to survive, and all human being has a great potentiality to express themselves, develop themselves as the part of the universe. And we are unique, so each person is irreplaceable, but at the same time, we are different. So we need to talk. We need to work, dialogue against violence. And all those things, and Canon Hersey is starting from the art and much wider activities. And I'm glad that I am one of the friends of those great people. And thank you very much. That's all I'd like to say right now.
Kamiza-san, very nice to see you. I always felt like you really understood from my first trip to Hiroshima. You really understood the sensitivity that I felt for the objects of the museum and how important they immediately became to me, and really helped us on this journey that now has allowed us to make incredible art together with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, because of your trusting and also really understanding that it's not an easy path, that John Hersey's path was not an easy path, and that, we must encourage each other. And I think that your encouragement to us in 2015, 2017, 2018, all along coming to New York together with the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the Disruptor Awards, it was really a great journey. And I look forward to seeing you in Tokyo or in Hiroshima soon.
Right. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Komizu-san. We're so grateful for over many, many years of support. And Canon, Koko-san is here.
I saw.
So we have to talk to her. We have to bring her in. Koko-san, ちょっと無茶ぶりで申し訳ないんですけれども、she's the only surviving character of the book Hiroshima. Koko-san has interaction with John Hersey himself, and she is the main subject of our documentary, Canon Find His Path, of John Hersey, but through Koko-san, Canon really found his own Hiroshima. So Koko-san, can you kind of talk to us a little bit about John Hersey's importance? Is she going to be able to do that? いかがですか？ちょっといきなり無茶ぶりで申し訳ない。
Coco, you don't have to go on if you don't want. It's wonderful to see you. I saw your face just for a couple minutes there.
Oh, here you go.
There you are. Hello. Oh.
ココさん聞こえますか？ ココさん、聞こえますか? But with you, Canon, that was really the wonderful segment that you met with Koko-san and took your journey into Hiroshima and deeper into Tanimoto-san, John Hersey and Tanimoto Kiyoshi, the Reverend from Hiroshima. Their friendship started it all. If there was no Tanimoto Kiyoshi writing the note for John, I think the book Hiroshima would have been a different story. But Kiyoshi-san was really the catalytic experience, right?
Yeah, I think that finding that letter, the handwritten note, 12 pages from Kiyoshi Tanimoto to John Hersey, that really was a backbone of the book, was Kiyoshi's telling of his and trusting to tell of his personal story to John Hersey, someone he didn't know, an American at that time, 9 months after, I think was one of those moments of kind of bravery and friendship and belief and trust in the universe to kind of take it forward, to take forward hope out of a very dark moment. And I think that finding that letter and then bringing that to Hiroshima and giving that to Koko in the park along the shore where your father, Koko, had saved so many people on the shore there. I think it was a really transcendent moment for me to think about him and to think about Kiyoshi Tanimoto and his lifelong bravery. And really, the more we dug, the more amazing a man he was at standing up against all of the issues, all the things that made Japanese mainstream culture slightly uncomfortable, even addressing the China-Japan tension from very early on. I think that, he was willing to talk about things that no one wanted to talk about. And I think that John Hersey and him shared that habit, that passion to talk about and to ask of people more than they were willing to give. And, consistently going ahead of culture to sort of say, no, this is not right, let's address this. Or, to see Kiyoshi Tanimoto talk about America, where he'd gone to school, and to really get a sense of that, how unjust it was, how unchristian, and how un-American it was to him, as someone who'd studied in America, to drop an atomic bomb, and asking America to look at itself and think about that. I just found his voice very, very alive and empowered by a sense of experience and how many people he cared for after the bomb, and sort of being a peace reverend of Hiroshima, really working with, many people carrying trauma and helping bring them to surgery, bring them to hope.
Please check the number and
was really important. So, Koko, it's great to see you. It seems like we're having a little bit of communication difficulty, but it's wonderful to see you, Koko. And
thank you so very much, Koko-san. Well, next time we'll have a full conversation with you again. Thank you very much. I think time is running out. I think we can, we'd like to speak with everybody. So stay here after this conclusion. I think we're going to finish around noon, 12 p.m. Koko-san, ありがとうございました. And maybe one more person, 野中さんよろしいですか? 野中智代さん. And she used to be an anchor person at NHK, and she is holding lots of wonderful, mind-boggling forums and communications throughout the world. So what did you think of this conversation and importance of John Hersey's Hiroshima?
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for having me and inviting me. And so this forum is starting from the Professor Peter Kuznick. It's so honored to be able to listen to what you say in live, Thank you very much indeed. And Soli-san, and when I was the anchor for NHK, the 60 Minutes documentary, I introduced so many your 60 minutes, maybe 1 million minutes or things. Well, then Keiko-san, so honored, and also Tak-san, so great. And Canon-san, somebody told the same story that the DNA of your ancestors, not only your grandpa and grandma and grandma's mother, blah, 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 and through that, the meet Hiroshima, and also through you, not only as a spirit of journalism, as a spirit of artist, not only the artist of professionalism, but as little kids like this size, and you are carrying your grandpa's the spirit. And today's, well, actually, I started as a journalist at Anchorwoman NHK, but after that, I was once and as a businesswoman, and also as a mini committee member for government. But for me, the most important thing is being mother of my daughter, and also being the wife, or being whatever, the family, the closest, the community around me is my international relationships with the others, the family member, even though family member, others, but with school kids, schoolmates, and also the job career society, and also blah, blah, blah. My perspective is like a centering is me, my existence, but the circles are so many different different degrees of, as Taku mentioned, the power itself is different gathering, different family grouping is having different kind of power. But for me, the most powerful power for human being is being alive, me and my existence, supporting through DNA from the fishing, I mean, before the fish, before this just a tiny little existence of being alive on this planet of Earth. So through hearing today's conversation, I think the three different kind of the points are in my mind. One is including me, just a tiny little, but what is a mission of journalism or journalist? But John Hersey told me that, as Keiko-san mentioned, especially we need more John Hersey even in the media society. Means, in other words, we should recognize ourselves individually. We have only one being alive. In Japanese, inochi. Tak-san, how do you translate it? Inochi. It's not as life, Life is just a superficial English word. The Japanese word inochi is even this, my mag cap is having inochi, life, inochi. So being is the most valuable and also very equal. It's no diversity. Only one person, only one being, right? So the mission of journalist, and the second is, what is being? Being is only one for each one, and the atomic bomb is so powerful to destroy our most important value on this planet of Earth. And Hersey-san mentioned as the very strong young and also woman. You mentioned woman, right? Is indispensable for without the women's power is not only the like gender word, but also the LGBT, including LGBTQ also. But nobody could get our own being through Father, right? So being is giving through being woman, the body. It's not that matter of the LGBTQ type of things. It's through being woman. So history for me is his story. So many the guest speaker mentioned his story. So his means he got the power even in the Roman days, right? So we need to have more, it's an equal, valuable planet of Earth through with being women's things. Because for being mother, the color of the skin or the pale or tall or the little tiny yellow skin doesn't matter at all. For us being mother, it's a very special to have that, because we already know everybody is having their own mother. So we can see not victim, the leader. No. You are just a boy. You are just a girl who have your own mother. So we can share the importance of that being. Sorry, that's
No, I would say
thank you
long.
so very much. Yeah.
So Taksan,
COVID definitely taught us all that female leaders did much better than male leaders when it came to COVID response as political head of state. And I think that when we look at the 21st century, certainly, I guess with 3 daughters myself, but in general, I hope that it will be the century of women, because men certainly did such damage in the 20th century.
Right. Don't call century of women, no, century of ours, We women love guys so much. Without guys, we cannot feel happy. So we need together, but behave, gentlemen, and behave men, and give us more opportunity, makes better life even for you yourself. It's a yin and yang. It's a balance.
Exactly.
So
inclusiveness.
that's the point, I guess. Sorry.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much for it. We should have a separate conversation, deeper conversation with you. And one more person talking about women. One more person of importance. We had this conversation last year with Yuki-san, Yuki Miyamoto. Yuki-san、すみません、また無茶ぶりですいませんけれども、一言もらってもよろしいでしょうか。Yuki Miyamoto is a professor at the DePaul University. She's been leading her class, and she takes her students from Chicago to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every other year, and wonderful education is being done. And she led the way for us to have a conversation about John Hersey. Last year, she interviewed Canon and also Koko-san last year. And if possible, Yuki-san, よろしいですか？ちょっと一言いただいてもよろしいですか？ Oh, maybe she's gone. Is she there? She was here. But maybe she's gone.
Did you make her a co-host?
No, I'm looking for her. She was just on the screen before, so I thought she's in attendance. She was here. Maybe she's gone. All right. So I think we should conclude this conversation, but stay as long as you want. We'd like to keep talking, and I love Peter. I love to bring you back in towards the conclusion of this conversation. Professor Kazumik gave us a great insight and perspective of the historical importance of Hiroshima. So Peter-san, what do you think of the relevancy of such work today?
Of the relevancy of Hersey's book, or of whatever we're talking about now?
Well, whatever we talked about today, the type of journalistic attitude, humanizing stories and tell stories no matter what the government says.
Well, first, I'd like to say it's so nice to see so many old friends tonight. I haven't seen Takai-san for a few years, and some of my other friends, so that's great. Secondly, I think that people stressed a lot the importance of the human connection, humanizing as opposed to dehumanizing, and John Hersey got that. I don't think anybody mentioned that a book that inspired him was Thornton Wilder's A Bridge of San Luis Rey, which was this that he read right before he went to Japan. And it's about 5 people in Peru, 5 very ordinary people whose lives intertwine, and just fate brings them together on a bridge that collapses, and all 5 are killed. And he gave him the idea of approaching his work in Hiroshima the way he did, to tell the story of 6 people whose lives happen to intersect, and to humanize the story and tell it from the perspective of the Japanese, not from the perspective of the Americans, and not in some ways not even from his perspective, but from the perspective of the people he was writing about. And I think that was an important, crucial insight that made the work as powerful as it was. There were so many things that were said. One of my frustrations, we're talking about journalism, and the frustration of trying to reach a large mainstream audience with our ideas and the messages we've been conveying today. For example, this past week, I've done more than 20 television interviews about Afghanistan, all over the world, all over Russia, all over China and other countries, not a single one on mainstream media in the United States. And I'm glad to hear that Sally has some ability to break through that and has successfully done that over the years. But people who've got a different perspective or a radical perspective are excluded from the discourse. And that's not just me, it was Howard Zinn, it's Noam Chomsky, it's Dan Ellsberg usually. People who've shown the kind of courage that we've been talking about tonight, the kind of courage that's so badly needed. And Sally talked a lot about race and racism. That's a serious problem. We've got one party in the United States now whose sole basis for existing is white supremacy.
Yeah.
A fascistic party at this point. And so these are very real, while the younger generation is very sensitive to racial issues, there are pockets of the United States that are still deeply racist. And we're going to, one of the problems we're going to see from Afghanistan is the refugees. We saw what happened a few years ago when the refugees out of Syria and other places, Libya, flooded into Europe, and how that created this kind of right-wing backlash. We're going to see that again if we don't get ahead of this problem now with Afghanistan also, where already we're seeing countries and people in the United States trying to prevent these people from coming now. So I think we're at a time when we've got tremendous problems in the world, in some ways greater than we've ever faced before. US relations with Russia, US relations with China are fraught with real immediate dangers. India and Pakistan. I mean, it's a very troubled world now in which we need journalists and we need professors and we need artists and we need average common people to be really taking that kind of responsibility that John Hersey. I mean, John Hersey is a great example. And there are a lot of other people who have also had that kind of courage. And we're at a time now when we got to be thinking globally. And you look at the leaders, and you've got a Biden who wants to make America great again, and you've got Putin wants to make Russia great again, and Xi Jinping wants to make China great again, and Modi wants to make India great again. And we have to be thinking as a planetary, a global species, and be thinking about the way we solve these problems. We live in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. And this is only getting worse right now. So I don't want to end on a negative note because everybody's been so positive, but I want to talk about, just mention how serious the crises that we're facing now are and how incumbent upon us all is to really be doing everything we can now to bring the kind of vision that John Hersey had, that Cannon has, that all the people who spoke tonight shared. And so thank you for letting me participate.
I think one of the big possible answers is what you've been doing, Peter, for 20 years, is bringing people for leadership training in Hiroshima to really think about those stories and then take that courage back out into the world. And it's something that Taku and I have been very committed to the last 7 years. We really feel like Hiroshima is a place in the world where people can really come to terms with the brutality that we have inside of our nations and inside of ourselves. And I don't think it's ever a one-way story or should be described as a victim story or as a guilt story. There's a lot of blame to be thrown all around the world, around World War II. And there's a lot of blame to be shared today, in terms of the breaking point that we've achieved. But I think that Hiroshima as a unique place in the world is a place for leadership training and thinking about what we can do at this breaking point to survive the world we've created. And I felt that so much being there. I know, Peter, you've been really doing that work for a long time, and I admire that. And Taku too, before me, doing that work with Hiroshima survivors in New York public schools and translating for Hibakusha. And I think that there's a work to be around, Kamiza-san, you too, as the central figure in doing that. We have to create more university, more learning facility, more opportunity, more art creation studio spaces for professional level talent to come and share those stories, because I think that this is the time for those stories to be heard. It's like John Hersey said in 1985, what will happen after there are no more survivors left to tell the stories of what it is to suffer a nuclear bomb. And that it was really thanks to the survivors' bravery that we hadn't used a weapon again at this point, when he went back in 85 and still today. It's really based on that courage of the Hiroshima survivors to retell that trauma that's kept us from not using the bomb again. But what will keep us over the next 100 years from that, when those survivors are not there to keep leadership, government, UN, considering what can happen, and considering the amount of power in the nuclear weapons of today, the weakest one being 100 times in strength of the Hiroshima bomb. I think we're really facing a very imminent doom there. But I think it's not just nuclear weapons. It has to be about climate change. It has to be about racism. It has to be about Chinese slaves in Japan and Korean slaves. We have to really open up some of these painful thoughts to really think about it in order to find a transcendence as a place and as an international people. We have to create those moments of transcendence for people to see each other differently. And I think Hiroshima is uniquely positioned for that. And I think that, you know, Peter, your work is incredible in that regard, but I feel like that needs to be taken to the next level in this next 10 years. And I hope we can go down that journey together, you know, so.
Wonderful. Well, with that note, I think we're going to conclude this portion of conversation here. And as I said, you know, please stay. We will chat. Anyone can talk. So we'll have that big forum. As always, at the end of the gathering, we just open the mic for everybody so that people can chat. But for this official program is ending here. And thank you so very much for everybody who came here, especially with you, Soli. Thank you so much for your insight. And Keiko-san, thank you so much, Keiko-san, for your insight. And Peter, wonderful.
Thanks for asking. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I really appreciate
wonderful.
it.
Great job,
Yes.
Taku. Thank you.
Likewise.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think
And a really inspiring conversation.
wonderful. Yeah, as John Hersey said, he wrote in 1985 for Chugoku Shimbun, Meaning of Memory essay. He said that the past, present, and future is linked with the bond of meaning of memory. That still resonates with us. That means that it's not just memory, it's a meaning of memory. And my understanding through that experience is that you put meaning to the memory itself from hibakusha, from whatever the atrocity, whatever the hardship, whatever the trauma there is out there. You engage, you learn, you create, and there is meaning to you. And that can be shared. And I think that can change the world. So thank you so very much, everybody. And we conclude it here, but this is not the end. This is the beginning of our conversation. And hopefully next time we have more conversation in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Take
night.
care. Alrighty. So yeah, I wanna open mic for everybody, especially Kuwajima-san, 中国新聞の Kuwajima-san, I think you have you wanna question Canon. So if you are here, I'm looking for her. Oh, maybe she's not here. She was here. Shoot. She wanted to interview you, so wanted to save some time for her.
Is that Ozeki-san there?
Yes, Ozeki-san is here.
Hello, sir. How are you? Nice to see you.
As always, Ozeki-san is here, and he's been wonderful.
Hi.
Inspiration.
Hi.
Hello. Hello. How are you?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Hi, どうも。
いかがでしたか、今日の会話
Thank
というのは。Yes. How was the conversation? Did you take away anything?
ちょっと喋っていいですか？
いいですよ、もちろん。
どうもありがとう。まずね、ピーター先生がまたいらっしゃったらお伝えしたいんですけど、私の長女がですね、アメリカン大学2年行ってた時に、非常に先生に授業でね、多分お世話になったんじゃないかと思います。
うん。
ですごくそういうね、なんか縁を感じていて、それからコウコさんの話なんかもよく聞いたっていうことを今、朝日放送にいる長女が喋っておりました。
すみません、ピーターさんがね、もう退出されたみたいです。
本当、じゃあ
伝えておきます。はい、もちろん。
はい、そういう話をね、してました。あとは、津山さんのお話もですね、この間の YouTube で日本記者クラブで喋っておられたアジアヘイトの問題とかね、ポリティカルコレクトネスの問題とか、要するにそのレイシズムのね、問題について非常に広く深く喋っておられたんで、津山さんのね、 コメントも非常に届いてきているという感じで、次のね、女性副大統領のね、本も楽しみにしたいと思います。あとは、この間もたくさんに申し上げたんだけども、このね、75年経っても不滅のですね、ジョン・ハーシーのこの本ね、これも僕大阪で結構探したんですよ。だから図書館にね、もうないんだよね。だからやっぱり日本の特に関西に限ってもね、図書館とか大学のね、そういうね、ミュージアムとか、ね。
And you can choose English channel so that the call is translating.
それをね、ぜひ、もう一回こうね、テキストをデリバリーするとかね、それを一つファンドでこう作っていくとかですね、僕もこれを結構大阪で探してですね、本屋もね、紀ノ国屋なんかもなくてですね、結局なんか地元の箕面のね、図書館の書庫に一冊だけあったんですよ。そんな状態なんでね、僕が一貫してやっぱりお伝えしたいのは、やっぱりどうリーチするかというね。つまり発信者は発信しててもね、リーチしないと意味ないわけですよ。そこのね、やっぱり今の学生とか、コロナで相当傷んでるね、やっぱり若者たちにね、やっぱりこういうジャーナリストがいたんだというね、つまりこういう、いわゆるある意味でのこの正義の伝道師というかな、ね、そういうことをどうリーチしていくかっていうことがやっぱり新しくて古い問題だと思うんですよ。ね、それを多分僕はキャノン・ハーシーのおじいちゃんも願っていることではないかなと。だから一つの方法としてはね、例えばジブリみたいなね、アニメーションみたいなものにできるのかできないのか。あともう一つはやっぱりもう簡単にその日米でね、こういうプロデューサーグループで今日のメンバーで例えばなんか一つのね、ドキュメンタリー作品をね、映画化するのかね、純粋の映画でもいいと思うんですけどね、もうそういう問題を例えば二重被爆者の問題なんかも含めてね、古くて新しい問題がまだまだあるわけですよ。ね。そういうものをなんかいろんな形でクラウドでやるのかね、朝日新聞社とか、つまりサントリーをね、例えば声をかけると、なぜかというと、この本の中にね、朝日新聞というね、表記が何回も出てくる。それから、ウイスキーを飲んだ、サントリーを飲んだって書いてあるわけ。ね、そういうのは、ある種のね、クライアントとしてはね、あるいは一緒にこうチームを作る制作委員会のメンバーに呼びかけるね、糸口にはなると思うんです。ね、
なるほど。
だからそういう、つまり、日本だったら日本財団とかね、いろんなお金を持ってるところがあるし、政府のね、文化庁の、これはたくさんよく知ってるんだろうけどね、文化庁の補助金とかさ、なんかいろいろね、平和をめぐるファンドみたいなのがあると思うんですよ。だからそういうものをどういうふうにこうね、原資として確保していくか。それでね、来年も再来年もですね、やっぱり夏が来ればね、思い出すというね、昔の夏の日のね、思い出じゃないけども、やっぱりリメンバー広島ということでね、まさに今日皆さんおっしゃってたように、これからがある意味でのリスタートだと思うね。だからそういう場合に、じゃあ誰がね、この、志を伝えていくのかなっていうことで言うと、僕がイメージしたのはね、やっぱり意味軸もアフガン戦争がね、非常にカオスになってて、アフガンに行ったやっぱり中村哲さんのその存在みたいなものがね、つまり評論家じゃなくて行動して黙って実現すると。クリークを作ったわけでしょ、彼は。だからそういうなんかこう、オピニオンリーダーをたくさん、ね、いなきゃいけないし、必要なんだけども、じゃあ、アクターは誰なんだ。で、アクターが実際にオーディエンスに対して届かないと、リーチしないと、やっぱり僕は、やっぱり我々の思いが伝わらないと思うんですよ。そこの課題をね、みんなで一緒に考えていく必要があるし、具体的にね、例えば分かんないけどね、この人がいいかどうか分かりませんよ。やっぱり、野中さんがいらっしゃったね、元 NHK にいた池上彰さんとかね、日本の中ではやっぱりね、結構若い人でも年寄りでも、彼がニュース解説をしたりすると、一応見るわけですよ。ゴールデンタイムのね。 で、そのクオリティの問題は、まあいろいろあるんだけども、でも、とりあえずリーチしてるわけですよ、それはね。このコロナ禍で結構みんなね、地上波テレビもまた見たりしてるからね。でそういうところ、つまり、ある種、今、このグループでやってるね、一つの大きな取り組みは非常に大事だしね、意味があるし、歴史的なことです。でも、ある種、そのヘイト主義を持ってる人から言うと、なんか、彼らはアイビーリーグだと、つまり。ね。つまり、エッセンシャルワーカーの仕事じゃないみたいな、なんかね、そういう流言飛語が僕は飛んでくるような、やっぱ反面そういう見方もあると思うの、やっぱりね。だそうじゃなくて、いや、みんなでね、これ考えるんだと。ね。いうところが大事で、そういう意味で言うと、じゃあ誰がね、例えば完全なハリウッドに通用するような、ね、いわゆるドラマですよね、完全に映画化するとすれば、例えば、万引き家族を作った是枝裕和とかね、元ドキュメンタリストですね、彼はね。それから是枝さんが師匠と思っているイギリス BBC 出身のケン・ローチとかね、ダニエル・ブレイクっていう作品を作って、あれは非常にカンヌですか、パルムドールを取ったんですけどね。こういう、まあ、ある種の、ね、ケン・ローチさんなんか87歳でオールドエイジだけども、そういう人たちに一緒にこうね、この輪の中に入ってきてもらうとか、そういった、やっぱりなんか一つの枠組み作りみたいなものがこれからね、来年、再来年ね、その次の年に向かって求められるのではないかというふうに、僕は思います。以上です。
まさに2017年からね、毎年尾崎さんが関西の学生たちを連れて広島にね、来てくれて、一緒にワークショップやって、ワークショップまさにそういう目的だったと思うんですよね。いろいろなアイデアをまず一緒に学ぼう。一緒に作ろう。で、作るにはどうすればいいのか。作るためにはやっぱり学ばなきゃいけないし、学んだことをどう表現するか。で、まさに今おっしゃったように、なんか、そうですね、ジョン・ハーシーなのかもしれないし、キャノン・ハーシーかもしれませんけれども、キャノン、in a way talking about creative process of telling stories, deep stories, important stories, so that it resonates with as many people as possible. Because Odeki-san is from the mass media, broadcasting background, I do too. But time is changing, but broadcasting, we are always talking about combining broadcasting contents, online contents, and physical gathering like this to cultivate the storytelling, how this story can resonate with as many people as possible. So I think that's the kind of step we've been taking, yeah?
I think that it's trying to create more resources for this type of work, which a lot of that has to be done before a commissioning producer. There's always a lot of research and learning and storytelling skill development that has to come before breakthrough stories are told. So I think that, trying to match kind of the learning environment, the sort of truth-telling environment, or creating, round circles of leadership, not hierarchical leadership, takes, often it takes a broadcast partner, like we wouldn't have been able to do all the work we did in Japan without NHK's support, just underwriting, travel, accommodation, teams of people, camera people, sound. I mean, invaluable support came from a broadcast partner. But at the same time, without the support of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, or without the support of the Hiroshima International Cultural Foundation and Chigoku Shimbun, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did either. So I think, and then I think the third part of that is the citizen, the people, the community that picks us up. People like Tomoko Watanabe, or people that housed us for years until we pissed them off so much they didn't want us in their house anymore. But I think that in general, it's sort of, it takes three legs to keep the chair up, which include media, broadcast media. That's probably the most protecting angle for activists or organizers. I think the nonprofit, the institution, the organization that are there play a pivotal role. And then I think, citizen activists or citizen people who care, it's that three-legged chair that holds up the opportunity to tell truth in a complicated scenario. And it's always walking a very fine line. I think, from my father, which we didn't know until Keiko, Taku, and I did the first interview for our Hiroshima Revealed film. The FBI used to come to John Hersey's house regularly after Hiroshima was written, just to see what he was up to. And I think that, when you create an environment of fear around, doing important journalistic work, which there is that fear all over the world, not just in places like Afghanistan, but places like the US and places like Japan. Until that sort of changes, it's going to always take a lot of risk by the journalists and by all of the players involved, because it's about creating an environment of trust and protection for people to do their best work. So yeah, I'll just put that out there, but it's great to hear from you, Ozeki-san.
Ozeki-san, thank you so very much.
Your work.
Yep. And I want to hear from Maeda Mari-san. Mari-san, いらっしゃいますか? She was with us. She was in New York. She's in Nagasaki now, and did a lot of reporting for us. And she's a journalist and
glad
doing a
to
lot
see you
of
again.
work.
今日は本当にありがとうございました。
Thank you so much for coming. いかがでしたか今日の。
オフにすると全員とお話できる。
大丈夫ですよ。はい。
はい、たくさんありがとうございました。なんかこういったイベントがあるというふうにお知らせいただいて。
いかがでしたか今日の対話をお聞きになりました。
そうですね。私自身も今長崎からつないでるんですけれども、一その長崎被爆者の方と、接する長崎にいる一人としてもそうですし、やっぱりそのメディアにいる自分として何ができるかなって日々感じるんですけど、やっぱりその被爆者の方が実際お話できなくなるっていうのを、一つの課題としていろいろ長崎市だったりメディアも感じている中で、やっぱりそのテレビプロデューサーの方の話で、やっぱりその共助、自分たちが何か助けることが、お互い助け合うことは何かっていうことだったり、競争で一緒に作っていくっていうことだったり、あと恵子さんのお話も次の進捗もすごく楽しみにしてますけど、なんかリーダーシップとって何かやっていくっていうパワーというか、なんかそういったところの気づきがすごくありました。
やっぱり我々も広島にずっと通いましてね、最初はね、被爆者の話を聞いてそれを伝えるっていうのが僕は94年からずっとやってたんですけれども、それを20年ぐらいやってワークショップを始めたときに思ったのは、やっぱ若い人たちが自分で伝える力、自分自身もそうなんですけれども、聞いてそのまま伝えるというよりは、やっぱ自分にとってどういう意味があるのかを本当に考えないと伝えることにならないと思ったんですね。それはドキュメンタリー作ることもそうだし、ワークショップをやっていてもそれで、ですから我々のワークショップってすごくユニークで、お話を、被爆者の話聞くんですけれども、それを本当に自分にとってどういう意味があるのかっていうのを結構ね、とことん喋るんですよね。でそこからやっぱり彼らなりに自分の表現っていうことが出てきて、で、3日4日ぐらいかけてやるんですけれども、そういう体験はやっぱみんな忘れないわけですよね。それはワークショップという特殊な環境なんですけれども、だからずっとその被爆の記憶を継承していくみたいなことを僕もずっとこの27年ぐらい考えてるんですけれども、簡単なことじゃないですよね。で、ジャーナリストとしては今朝最初の恵子さんとの話もあったけど、やっぱトラウマをね、引き受けるっていう。これ本当に簡単なことじゃなくて、僕も最初に被爆者の話聞いたときはもうどうしていいか、何を聞いていいか分かんなくて、あう状態だって、もう聞くだけしかできなかったんですけれども、でもやっぱりそこから一歩ずつみんな踏み出していく。で、それは別にジャーナリストだったり、ライターだったりだけじゃなくても、これは誰もができることだと思うんですよね。で、自分ができることをやっていくっていうことを、それぞれの人がね、掴んでいったと思うんですけども、やっぱり自分で考えて自分でやるっていうこと自体をみんなが考えないとダメなんじゃないかなっていうのは、そのワークショップだって実感ですね。
やっぱ自分ごと化して考えるっていうのはすごくやっぱテーマだなと思います。で、あとね、やっぱりジョン・ハーシーさんがそういうふうに残されたっていうのもすごく大事なので、さっき尾関さんの提案もあったんですけど、やっぱり今みんなオンライン授業になってしまってるので、長崎のまん延防止が出て。なので、例えば気になることがあったら、 ネットで調べたりとか iPhone もいつも片手にみんな持っているって状態なので、例えばデジタル化で期間限定でこの何日間だけ電子書籍にするとか、なんかこうすごく近いこうアプローチがすぐできそうな気もしますね。
恵子さん、ちょっと一緒に喋りませんか？そういう、そこら辺の話はいかがですか？どういうふうにしていったらいいかとか。
私ですか？
はい。
ありがとうございました。恵子さん、Thank you very much。
マリちゃん、ありがとう。なんかもう、残ってる方はみんな日本人の方なんですか？日本語で話して
一応
るんですか？
ね、日本語で大丈夫ですよ。英語の翻訳も一応つけています。
本編ではお話ししませんでしたけれども、私は実は長崎平和特派員というタイトルを長崎市長から任命されてまして、なぜかというと、長崎支局に冒頭お話したように2年間いたということと、その後つかず離れず、その被爆者のストーリーというのをどんなポジションにいても書いてきたと。で なおかつ特に共同通信をやめてフリーランスになってからは NPT などの、大きなイベントに際してですね、世界中から集まってくる被爆者の方の、通訳のボランティアなどをして、でまたそれも記事にしたりしてたということで、長崎平和特派員というのを拝命したわけなんですけども、これはドメスティックな問題ではありますが、やっぱりこの先広島と長崎の、一体化というかですね、協力っていうのがすごく望まれるなと、数年痛感しています。被爆者団体も先ほどお話ししたように長崎では私が担当したところは4つあったんですね。今いくつになってるんでしょうか
？3つですね。大きな団体。
まだ3つある。
ありますよ。それぞれ皆さん、9の日に滑り込みされてます。はい、
そうですね。でも、そういった枠組みは残っていてもいいんですけれども、キャノンの、それからたくさんのプロジェクトとか、それからもっと若い人たちのプロジェクトが、別に広島、長崎に限らず、東京であったり、その県外で走ってるわけですね。だからそういったパワーをどうにかして統一することができないんだろうかっていうのを、感じています。本当にちょっといろんな方にまたお話をしながら自分の考えをまとめていかなくちゃいけないなと思います。
我々はゼロプロジェクトとか、その前からやっても、よく使う言葉はコモングラウンドっていうんですけどね、それはもう被爆者の団体だけじゃなくて、もうはっきり言って反核とか被爆のことに興味のない人も、ね、入ってくれるぐらいのコモングラウンドを作りたいと思っていて、それは教育者であったりとか、アーティストであったりとか、で、ピカロプロジェクトもそうだったと思うんですけれども、あれは割とパリだったり、ロンドンだったり、上海でもありました、海外でね、ニューヨークで、核って一体何だろうっていうことで、そういう意味で間口がすごく広く低い、敷居が低い形で、みんなちょっと考えてみようっていう、で、やっぱり、ものすごく大雑把な言い方をすれば、やっぱりヒューマナイズするというね、もしくは国と国の戦いであったりとか、核兵器とかもしくはピカドンっていうことが起きたってことは、もちろんアメリカが日本に落としたんだけれども、やっぱり人間が人間にしたことですよっていう、それはまさにチョン・ハーシーが始めた語り口だと思うんですよね。だからそういうようなことでコモングラウンドを作るっていうのは、僕らはすごく可能性を感じているし、で、そういうところだと誰でも入ってくれるっていうか、いろんな道があって、いろんな団体があっていいと思うんですけど、でもこの広場は、このコモングラウンドは誰でも入ってこれて、少しでも、核兵器をなくすっていう目標があってもいいし、そうじゃなくてもいいと。でも平和のためにね、みんなが話し合える場があるっていう。で今、場すらないということがずっと76年来てるし、特に核の問題に関して、特に日本では、核兵器が落ちたことの意味 を国民的に全く議論して、議論が封殺されてきたと思うんですよね。だから、その賭場口にすら立ってないと思うんですよね。これ一体どういうことなのか。で、どうしなきゃいけないのか。で、コンシャスに学んでいる人は、ここに集まっているような方はみんなコンシャスにどうすればいいかって考えていると思うんですけども、国民的な議論としては全くないと思うんですよね。だからそこで何かしらきっかけになるようなことがないかなと、いろいろ考えてるんですよね。
こういったズームのオンラインで本当にみんながつながりやすくなったって
う
いうこと、
ん。
フェーズとして去年と今年またこう変わってきたなと思うのが、若い人たちがその被爆者だけじゃなくて自分たちが語り部になって修学旅行生、県外の子どもたちに伝えるっていうのが、8月6日の朝の NHK のおはよう日本でも NPO 団体が取材されてたり、長崎は NPO でそういったお金を回してなってないけど、そういうふうにやってるサラリーマン大使とかいらっしゃるんですよ。なんで、東京にもいるから、つながるとすごくなんかうまく機能するっていうのを考えたとき、やっぱ教育とかそれを支援する体制、メディアなのか、そういう仕組みなのか、そういうなんかビジネス的な、ビジネスっていうとちょっとなんか言葉が強いですけど、そういうベンチャー的な、何か違う価値観をこのコロナ禍に考えたり、どっと進めるっていうのは、できるチャンスだなっていうのは、去年から今年にかけて肌で感じてます。
なるほど。今回、フューチャーメモリーというプロジェクトを立ち上げて、去年からやってるんですけども、それが今年は東京でね、展覧会をすることができたんですね。そこなんかは、割と不動産や、小売りをやっている大きな企業があって、そこがやっているギャラリーで、非常に新しいことをやんなきゃいけないと。で、今までだったら広島や長崎のことは広島、長崎にお任せするというつもりだったんだけど、そうじゃないんだっていうのを気づいた経営者やアントプレナーの人がいっぱいいるんですよね。そういう人たちをオーガナイズして結構来ていただいたりとか、一緒に広島にツアーしたりみたいなこともやったんですよね。だからそこら辺は割とこの数年で随分変わってきたな。
ぜひそのノウハウとか、どんなしたら他にも
まだまだですけど
教えていただけたら、ありがたいです。
すみません、もう一人、今また無茶ぶりシリーズでちょっと一方聞きたいんですけど、いやいや、どうぞ、このままいていただいて、甲斐さん、和美さんが長崎つながりなんですけど、いらっしゃってるので、もしよろしければ、いかがですか、お話を、感想などをお伺いしたいんですけれども。
こんにちは。
こんにちは。
聞こえます。
はい。
お久しぶりです。
久しぶりです。
長崎に十和の会の朗読劇を来てくださって以来ですよね。あの時はたまたま英語での朗読劇をたまたまやろうというお話になっていて、本当にたまたまいいタイミングでいらっしゃったなっていう時だったんですよね。で、今日はすいません、本当にもう用事があって、最初の出だしのほんの少しと最後の方しか聞けてなくって、皆様に追いついていないんですけれども、なんかもう変なこと言っちゃうかもしれないので、どうしようと思っているんですが、
やっぱりどうぞ。
はい、前回聞かせていただいた記憶の継承、ということに非常に私たちももう本当にどうやってこの被爆の記憶を継承させていくのかっていう次世代にですね、これから高齢化されていく被爆者の方々の経験っていうことを忘れちゃいけないし、それをただの思い出、記憶とすることではなくて、やっぱりただの記憶ということだと、やっぱりどうしてもそんなことがあったのかっていうふうになってしまうかなって思うんですよね。で、私たちはその朗読を通して記憶の継承っていうことをやってるんですけれども、小学校とか中学校、高校とかにも回らせていただいてるんですよね。でも小学校の皆さんにお話しするときって、ちょっと前まではね、皆さんのおじいちゃん、おばあちゃんに戦争の話が聞けますねって聞いたことありますかとかっていう感じで、問いかけたりすることがあったんですけど、今の小学生ってもうおじいちゃんおばあちゃんの時代も戦争の経験してないんですね。だからも もしかしたらもう皆さんのひいおじいちゃん、ひいおばあちゃんのお話になりますねって。で、76年前って本当に子どもたちにとったら大昔なんですよね。なので、そのギャップをね、どうやって埋めたらいいのかなっていうところが課題なんですよね。なので、前回のアートを通してとか、いろんな皆さんの取り組みを知ることができて、私も学ばせていただきましたし、自分たちの活動にこういうことを取り入れたらいいかなっていうふうな、気づきだったり、そういうのがあってよかったなっていうふうに思っています。絵本だったり紙芝居だったりっていうものも使いつつ学校で朗読会を開いたりはしてるんですけれども、もっとこう自分事として捉えてもらえることができるようになるにはどうしたら伝わるのかなっていうのは常に課題として考えています。皆さんのお話も聞かせていただくと嬉しいです。
いや、本当に僕も94年ぐらいからですか、26、7年、本当まさにそのテーマでね、ずっとものを作ってきたんですけれども、最近開き直ってるっていうか、ワークショップをやって、ここ7年ぐらい、広島、長崎でワークショップをやって、開き直れたというと、大雑把すぎるかもしれませんが、と思うのは、被爆者の話聞くじゃないですか。本当に心が動くじゃないですか。で、これを伝えたいと思うじゃないですか。で、それ大事なんですけれども、でも僕が被爆者になることはできないんですよね。その同じ物語を同じ言葉を喋ったとしても、同じ質量と同じ熱量を伝えることは、これはもうはっきり言って不可能なんですよね。無理です。でも、それを自分ごとにすることは誰でもできる。あなたの話を私はもらいました。聞きました。もしくは読みました。それを自分ごとにすることは、これは絶対誰でもできるんですよね。だからそこが僕も高校生、大学生の若いね、人たちとワークショップをやっていて、みんな悩むんですよ、それ。ものすごく重いし大変だし、もう聞きたくないっていうふうに思っちゃうこともあるし、重すぎて伝えられないとみんな思うから、それはそう思った方がいいんですけれども、でもその上でね、でも少なくとも自分ごとにはできるよね。で、自分ごとにしたら何年かかってもいいんですよ。明日じゃなくてもいい。5年後、10年後でもいいから、それが自分にとって意味が生まれる。ミーニング、メモリーが生まれて、それをいつか伝えるとき、それは自分の子供に対してかもしれないし、自分の家族かもしれないし、自分のコミュニティかもしれないし、必ず一旦被爆者からお話を、もしくはこういう勉強をしたんだったら、必ず伝えるタイミングが来ると思うから、そこまで焦らずにやればいい。で、その人たちは今、20歳だったり、18歳だったり、30歳だったり、で、これから何十年も生きていくわけですよね。そういうことに僕は希望を託していくしかないんじゃないかな、とは思ってるんですよね。
やっぱり大切なのは、本当にこれは認めたくないですけども、英語にすることですね。やっぱり上半身の広島がこれだけニューヨーカー紙が掲載して、もうすぐに全世界のメディアが衝撃を受けて、BBC が全部朗読したテーマとかですね、それからあらかじめ送っておいた新聞社がその発行日の朝刊のコラムに今日こういうのが出るから買うべきだっていう推薦文を書いたりっていうことができたのはやっぱり英語だったからなんですよ。で、悔しいかな、英語を話している人口っていうのは世界の 25% くらいなんですけれども、でもその波及力たるや、もうその 25% なんていうのにはもう全くかなわない、ところがあるんですね。だからやっぱり皆さんがなさっている活動、それからマリちゃんがやっているプロジェクトなどもなるべく英語で発信するっていうのがすごく重要だと思います。で、私がやっていたその被爆者の通訳の、ボランティアでやっぱり学校に行って被爆者の方の真横で通訳をするっていうことを何回もやったんですけども、その反響はね、もうちょっと言葉では伝えられないものがあって、自分自身も非常にきつかったですけれども、 でもやってよかったなって思うんですね。で、今日くしくも私がフェリスという女子校に行ったんですけれども、その中学1年生の時に、Day1 ですね、初日に英語を教えてくれたエレノア・ノールデン先生という、
先ほど、
先生が今日聞いてくださっていて、
すごい。
素敵ですね。デイワンの時の先生と今もつながってるんです。
もう口移しで英語を教えてくれた、宣教師の先生ですね。でやっぱり彼女がそうしてくれたから、40年後、30年後、40年後の今、こうやってその英語のイベントに参加して、で、ピーター・カズニック教授などのですね、素晴らしいその証言を聞くことができる、それからキャノン・ハーシーともつながっている、彼のその取材の動向もできたっていうのは、まさにエレノア・ノールデン先生のおかげで、だからその英語の重要性を痛感しているんですね。だから本当になるべくその英語と日本語と両方の発信っていうのが今必要とされてるなって思っています。
いや、本当に発信すること、表現することですね、まずはね。で、僕らは割とプロでね、プロって言って偉そうにするわけじゃないんですけれども、トレーニングされて書いたり映像を作ったりするってことをやってるんですけども、やっぱりワークショップなんかやってて一番思うのは、何をどう伝える、なぜっていうところ、どうしても仕事だと、僕なんか特にいろんなプロジェクトいっぱいやってると、もう割と流れ作業になってしまうことがあるわけですよね。もうこうやってこうやってこうすればこうやって語れば伝わる。でもう1ヶ月で作りましょう。みたいな流れ作業的になってしまうことがあるんですけども、やっぱり被爆者のお話やワークショップで何か作るって時は、これなぜ伝えてるのかみたいなことを、かなり根源的なことを考えないと伝えきれないんですよね。これ本来当たり前のことなんだけど、当たり前のことに気づいて、で、しかも我々キャノンと僕常に一緒にやってますから、我々ゼロプロジェクトって呼んでるやつは、別に広島から発信するとか、ニューヨークから発信するではなくて、常に共にあるんですよね。普段僕らニューヨークに住んでるし、で、たまに広島に行ったり行かなかったり、今回オンラインでつながりしますけれども、どこから発信ではなくて、もう一緒ですよ。常に一緒のコモングラウンドで一緒に作ってますよ。一緒に感じてますよ。という場が僕は大事だと思うんですよね。で、そういうのをみんな気づいていただくと、なんだ、ニューヨークなんて簡単につながれるじゃんって言って、英語でやってみよう。で、英語にする仕事も僕も随分やってますけれども、それをさらにね、充実させていけば、より敷居が低くなって、より伝えたり、あとは楽しくなきゃいけないんですよ、僕は。いや、しんどい話ですよ、はっきり言って。でも、紙芝居にしたり、映像にしたり、ラップを作る人もいるし、それやっぱり楽しいというとちょっと語弊があるとするならば、インスパイアリング。やっぱ心が震え、体験というのは人間にとってすごく大事なことだし、しんどい苦しいだけではなくて、やっぱり何か心がアップリフトされる。それが先ほど来られてたココさんのね、お話で、これ本当にしんどい話ですよ。タフな話ですけれども、でもやっぱ、ココさんの素晴らしいところは、彼女がそんだけの思いをして、70何年も生きてこられて、でも今目の前で我々に語ってくれているっていう、そのことそのものがホープなんですよ。それがもう希望なんだと。で、みんながそれを分かるし、悲しいし、みんなもう泣いちゃうんだけど、でも終わった時にアップリフテッド、心が大きくなってるっていうか、重くなってるんじゃなくて、より軽くなってる、大きくなってる。そういう体験をするんですよね。そういうことは可能なんだなと僕はいつも被爆者の話を聞いて思っていて、そういうことをちゃんと言葉も超えながらね、やっていくのがとても大事じゃないかなと、いつも思ってますね。
すいません、そろそろちょっと退出いたしますけれども。
かなり夜中になってまいりました。
本当に今日皆さんありがとうございました。
素晴らしいお話で。
長いこと聞いていただいて。
ありがとうございました。
たくさんありがとうございました。い
やー、もう、恵子さん、ね、またやりましょう。
声をかけていただいて。
何十年も。
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
Are you done? I think we are closing it up. キャノンも出たんじゃないAnyway, 皆さん、
Thank you, Keiko.
yes.
It's definitely getting late here too, but you know, thank you for gathering here together with us, and yeah, it's great to spend some time together with all of you, and you know, thank you for making time, and let's make more time to do more, and you know,
Yes.
thank you all.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. Excellent. はい。じゃあ一旦ここで終わりましょう。本当に、いろんな方来ていただきましてありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
はい。
良い一日を。
はい、おやすみください。父さんも、通訳もありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
あと聞いてましたからね。
TK もありがとうございました。本当
ありがとうございます。ヘ
タコが変なので、いつもの話で。はいはい。それじゃあどうもです。
TK おおきに。ありがとうございました。ヘダー、thank you so much for coming.
まだ生きてます。もうそろそろ寝るとか言ってたところで。
こっちはかなり遅くなってきてますんで。はい。本当にありがとうございました。いやいや。前回もそうだったんですけど、結構みんなね、残ってずっとだべったんですよ。
そうなんだ。
2時間ぐらいだべってたんですけど。
まだまだ若いということですね。
そう、再現ないんですけどね。
私は明日お参りがあるので行きます。
本当にありがとうございました。はい。
ありがとうございました。たくさん呼んでくださってありがとうございました。
本当にさんありがとうございました。またぜひやりましょう。
はい、ゆっくりお休みくださいね。
ありがとうございました。失礼します。マリさんも本当にありがとうございました。
はい、やっぱり言語が両方あるってすごくいいなって、ズーム知らなかったので、ちょっと今後
これね、結構大変なんですけれども、
これってプロフェッショナル用じゃないと無理ですか？
これは、僕は一応、なんだっけな、プロアカウントかな。でも、月$19の安いやつですけど、はい、もっと上のやつも$190のやつがあるんですけど、それはもうもっとあるんですよ。でも、このインタープレテーションはすごく便利ですね。
いいですね。で、しかも今日80人以上いらっしゃっても全然安定してたので、
安定してましたね。
取りやすかったです。
よかったです。ありがとう。コウ君ありがとう。本当に素晴らしい。いつも裏方が。
クリアな声で聞き